To help us explain what this means for Americans is Errol Pierre of Health First, a not-for-profit care organization. You were here just a week or two ago,
yes,
explaining some of the ins and outs of the Affordable Care Act. And part of what we talked about were ensure that we're getting these cancellation policies that continue to grow and mushroom. And now the president made this statement today about this quote-unquote fix. Is this a fix, Errol?
I would say that it allows flexibility. So prior to the comments from the president, it was a done deal. All the withdrawals were going to happen on 2014 by the law. This is now an out. And, you know, there's lots of more information that insurers will need and that customers will need to really figure out the devil's in the details. I think it allows flexibility so that insurers, if they so choose, can decide to keep these plans in place.
And let's talk about the caveats here, because he has, as we said at the top of the show, sort of opened the door for a resolution of this, but it requires the states, the state insurance commissioners to decide to do this, as well as the insurance policy. So in practical terms, what does this do for an American whose policy either might be or has already been canceled?
Yeah, I think it's too early to tell. You know, the jury's still out. So I think what would happen is probably all the insurers right now are waiting for insurance commissioners to figure out what they want to do. And it'll range based on state. So some states have a big impact. You know, there's a Kaiser study that said California has a lot of these folks that got stuck in plans that are getting terminated. There's other states that have very small numbers. So I think it's going to be a state-by-state decision based on the impact and based on, you know, how much the people in those states are upset.
Does this quote-unquote fix raise more questions than it does provide answers?
I think it does at this point, because we just got the information. So, you know, some of the questions that folks are asking is, you know, what's the notice requirement? Or if I lost my plan in June, what does that mean? Because it already lapsed. And the other thing is, you know, the extension is for a year. So folks will have to eventually look at the exchange in 2015 and 2016 because the extension would be for a year. So I think there's still outstanding questions. And, you know, the good news is that the door is cracked open. So there's some hope, but I think we still need more details.
Now, let's talk about those plans. There were some plans that were supposed to be grandfathered in anyway. This allows others, and I don't know if grandfathered is the correct term, but to be allowed in as well. Talk about them.
Sure. So, and it was mentioned earlier, so the grandfather clause happened back in 2010 when the bill was actually signed into law. And it said if you had your plan, there were some things that had to be added to that plan, which were like removing limits. So you couldn't say, you know, you have coverage up to a certain dollar amount and that's it. So you had to remove type of limits. Those things had to be added, but there were other things that didn't need to be added, like having preventive care for covered at $0 or 100%. So those plans, if there were no changes or very subtle changes, were allowed to stay. And no changes mean you didn't raise the copay, you didn't raise the deductible. There were some other rules around employer contributions. And it was very hard to do that for 3-4 years with the same policy because policies always change. Everyone goes to open enrollment every year and looks for another policy. So a lot of those grandfather plans every year has kind of dwindled in number. And what this rule and what this guidance sort of came out was say, hey, anyone who got a withdrawal, we're going to put that under the purview of the grandfathered clause. And that's sort of how they're using it. So they're resurrecting the grandfather clause for these specific groups of people.
Okay, very, very quickly, you can do a yes or no. Of course, Mary Landrieu has introduced a piece of legislation that essentially would codify what the president has already said. Do you think something like that is necessary?
I don't know.
Unfair to ask you yes or no.
Yeah, well, so what I would say is the insurance commissioners have state law, and then there's federal law. And there's probably going to be very smart people to figure out which ones supersede the other ones.
You're going to do well if you run for office one day. Errol Pierre, thank you very much.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Good to see you.